is a bilingual education school program in the U.S. Midwest, working as a racial project, a project that engages in racialization, the process of delineating racialized groups and hierarchies. Today, we're going to look at how the racially and linguistically diverse dual language program constructs ideas about race and forms the Latinx group with our special guest, Professor Laura Chávez-Moreno. And she is the author of the book, How Schools Make Race. Laura, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Desiree. I'm really happy to speak with you and honored to be invited. Thank you.
You bet. Okay. I was reading through your materials and reading through your book and going, wow, this is when you talk to somebody who's a researcher, who's in academia, a lot of times they take these very rich, deep dives into a topic. And I might have butchered it a little bit when I was trying to describe it there in the intro. So could you, in your own words, tell us about your book and the premise?
Thank you. Yeah, I could begin with the title, How Schools Make Race, and it's to share the assumption that our society is already racialized. It is racialized. It is a society that's organized by race. That's what that means. That's what I mean by that. And it also talks about the fact that we construct that as a society, and we construct ideas about what are the racialized groups in our society and the hierarchy of those groups. And schools, as a very important institution in our society, they help reinforce those ideas and reinforce the idea that these hierarchies should exist.
Can you unpack that a little bit? How are schools doing that? Now, are they doing it in a positive way and a negative way, in both ways? Can you tell us a little bit more about the nitty-gritty of that?
Of course. So they do it in lots of different ways, sometimes without even knowing. Actually, most of the times they do it without knowing. A lot of the times they do it through their curriculum, through pedagogy, through how they award, for example, honors, or how they put track students into classes, like whether they're going to be remedial or honors classes or AP classes. All of these practices that we know, that some of us who have gone to public schools, we have experienced these. Those all contribute to how we think about race and who's worthy, for example, of resources. And what happens in schools is that a lot of the times we're not really taught intentionally or in a very explicit way, like this is race. That could happen. And in fact, one of the things that we can chat about later is about the idea that we should be talking about it. But that's not really what the book is only focused about. I do go through how teachers are teaching about race explicitly, but what I'm also trying to show is those are just lessons that are not really what's reinforcing the ideas. It's a lot of other things that we don't perceive in schools that reinforce ideas about race.
Let's get into that, because I think what's happening in many ways is people have the best intentions, right? We do things with the best intentions of making things better for our society, for our students, for our world. And in reality, it might not necessarily work that way. Why and how do you think we should rethink race? Can you give us some ideas on what you propose?
Sure, thank you. One of the ideas that I propose in the book, as you started the intro with, is that schools are a racial project. And for example, bilingual education specifically is a racial project because it provides resources. It doles out resources to groups based on their racial group. And one of the things that I argue for in the book is that as a society, we have to recognize that's actually how race and racial groups are made, by the unequal distribution of resources. So when an institution, for example, like schooling, engages in practices where it's honoring, for example, or giving resources, degrees, et cetera, to one group more than another, it's reinforcing the idea that, especially because what happens is those awards are distributed unequitably based on, for example, race, that reinforces the idea that there is a racialized that there are racialized groups. One of the things that I talk about in the book is how, for example, a bilingual education program that has all the intentions that you mentioned in terms of hoping to improve the educational outcomes of Latinx students, it engages in a society, it's in a society that is racialized and that already has structures in order to maintain the different hierarchies that we know throughout our society. So it's battling against that at the same time as it's trying to counter the historical racism that the Latinx community has faced in the U.S., which is, for example, the banning of bilingual education, the assimilation of Latinx students, disregarding their culture, languages, etc. So bilingual education is really trying to be an anti-racist project in our society. The issue is that it's doing that within structures that are designed to maintain that racist society. So there's this tension. Another thing that I talk about in the group is that through its lumping of students into the program, it was a racially diverse program, but it still did a lot of designating and labeling of students. And in that process, even though it was trying to provide like an anti-racist counter, like I mentioned before, in doing that, it also constructs ideas about what is the Latinx group. Some of those ideas I can share in more depth if you'd like.
Oh, yeah, please do, because I think that's another part of this puzzle. You talk about lumping people together and lumping groups together when the reality is the Latinx group as a whole, that's the thing. It's not this nice, tidy little lump. There's a lot of diversity just under that. And I think that might be part of the issue that you're describing.
Yes, thank you. So the bilingual education program was a Spanish-English program, and it was it's a racially diverse program in a Midwestern state. And what that meant was it was a dual language program. So it was a program that was trying to teach, the goal is to teach biliteracy in Spanish and in English to students who are, for example, labeled as English language learners. So, for example, they're dominant in Spanish when they enter school in like elementary school. And it placed also in the same classroom, half of the classroom was what we would consider English dominant students. So students who wanted to learn Spanish. So putting them in the same classroom and dividing the class half and half in this Midwestern context meant that the Spanish language dominant students were mostly Latinx students, or all of them were Latinx students. And then the other half, the English dominant who were learning Spanish, were mostly white students with maybe one or two Asian or Black students. So that itself was a dynamic that was interesting to study, because it was also interesting to see how in this type of environment, a Midwestern, for example, environment, the idea about race was being taught to the students. And then also, what is the Latinx group? Like, how are they supposed to act? What do they like, etc. So a lot of the different ideas that people may have about like what is Latino, the teachers, happily enough, were challenging these ideas. They were challenging ideas that it was just, for example, just Mexican culture, and that is Latinx, for example. So I thought that was really good for students to experience. The teachers really brought in a lot of examples from different Latinx groups and their different cultural practices. So that was something that the students experienced in terms of a good way for us to think about the diversity within the group. What was challenging was also because of this idea in our society that race is based on skin color and based on looks or the appearance of folks, then that created some type of confusion with students when they were thinking about the Latinx group as, for example, a racialized group. And there were some tensions between thinking about it as a race group, as a racial group, versus like an ethnic category or an ethnic group. And I could chat about that tension if you'd like.
Yeah, please do. I think that's really fascinating. And how it's broken down like that and how people perceive it, I think is really interesting and important for folks to understand. So please do.
Thank you. Yeah. And one of the great things, I think, one of the contributions of looking at, for example, the idea about whether the group Latinx is a race or not, is because in our society here in the US, we already have very clear that, for example, white and black are racialized groups. They are races, what some people call. So lots of people don't really question that. That's kind of like, oh, okay, well, yeah, that's a race, that's a race. So looking at this more ambiguous group can be very instructive for us in terms of how to understand what is race. So one of the things that I noticed in the students was that they were learning, for example, that the Latinx group had these different cultural practices and all the diversity within that. But that's interesting because when I would ask them about what is Latinx, if it's an ethnic group, et cetera, everyone would answer that it was an ethnicity, the teachers and the students. So they would answer that it was an ethnicity, even though when we think of an ethnicity, it's a group that shares cultural practices. But that's interesting because, like I mentioned before, a lot of the teachers were combating the idea that there was actually just these shared cultural practices. So there's this tension, right? So then when I would ask students, okay, well, is it a race? Or what is race? The students would answer, oh, it has to do with skin color, for example. And then when we look at, for example, in the classroom, the Latinx students, we could see the diversity in skin tones. So it was interesting to think about that. Okay, so that helped students then say like, oh, well, then Latinx is not a race, they're an ethnicity, even though there was this contradiction because they have different cultural practices. And then again, when they were learning about the Latinx group, it's interesting that the teachers and the students, for example, shared and learned about different experiences that the Latinx group has with racism. So with racist practices in our society. So it is a group that, for example, students understood as like having a sense of like a historical injustice in the US and that they named as racism. But then how did they make sense of that with then understanding them as not a race? So that's an interesting tension that I explored in the book. And I'm happy to talk about that if you'd like.
Yeah, please do. I think it's interesting too, how you talk about the teachers learning alongside of the students. You know, this was something that, and you mentioned earlier too, and I want to unpack that a little bit. Your message for teachers, for instructors, for, the programs that are out there, but please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and if I could share also, when I was visiting the students, the classrooms and sitting with the students and seeing the lessons that the teachers gave, I really wish that I would have had that type of education when I was a student. I grew up in Arizona. Bilingual education was not available to me. And I think I would have really benefited from a lot of the teachers' lessons that I saw the students receive. But one of the things that I ended up thinking about was then I was curious because when I saw these type of tensions and these contradictions in the classroom that I mentioned earlier about, like, for example, ethnicity, race, and skin color, that made me question my own assumption about whether the Latinx is a group or not, because I had imagined that it was. And then all of a sudden I started hearing a lot of discourse in society, not just in the classrooms, but just society in large, saying that the Latinx group was an ethnicity. So I started questioning that assumption that I had and looking to see, well, what is race? What is race in terms of like how our society organizes its groups? And what I found in the literature was that race is made through the unequal distribution of resources in our society. Mm. And when we think about that, the Latinx group has had and continues to suffers through this unequal distribution of our society. When you look at all of the different things that our society allocates in terms for one group versus another, the Latinx group is discriminated against in terms of race, racial distribution of resources. And I show in the book how that happens, for example, even though the bilingual education program is trying to combat this.
Right, exactly. So what kind of solutions then do you suggest?
Thank you. One of the things that I talk about in the book is that because education and because bilingual education is in an institution that is racialized and contributes to forming our ideas about what is race and the racialized groups in our society, teachers have to recognize that whether they like it or not, whether they intend to or not, and I show this a lot in the book, through their lessons and through the institution of schooling, students are learning about race, even if perhaps not explicitly. So because that is the case, we can't just decide, oh, well, I'm not going to teach about that. That's taboo, et cetera, et cetera. We do have to teach in a way that is anti-racist and anti-race, in the sense of teaching that race is something that our society creates through the unequal distribution of resources. So we hear a lot of talk in our society about how race is a social construction, and then that there's systemic racism, et cetera. And my book really shows what those ideas mean, because we hear about them a lot, but sometimes we don't really know like exactly how that works. So the book shows a contemporary example that I think people can relate to, because it shows how this happens in education.
Do you feel that your book is more towards educators and teachers, parents, just society as a whole? Who really should be reading your book?
So I wrote the book in order for it to be accessible to teachers, to parents, and to school leaders. I'm hoping that they read it in order for teachers, for example, educators, to see their role in reinforcing or challenging, hopefully challenging the ideas about that we have that are unhelpful in terms of what is race and what is racism, for example. And I'm hoping for parents and for school leaders to also see that they play a role in supporting teachers in having the resources in order to teach critically about race, and then to also fend off political attacks from outsiders, for example, that is happening in our society now.
All right. And yeah, those political attacks, this is a precarious time in our history. And I speak to teachers and librarians, especially, being in the bookish world, that are feeling the pushback and feeling the pressures and feeling forces pushing down on them. Thoughts on the politics of things and how that is impacting the students in schools and the teachers as well?
Yes, thank you. One of the things that I'm hoping people take away when they read the book is to find a collective in order to not feel alone. So, for example, teachers learning with others in order to learn how to teach about race. Some of the teachers expressed to me that they felt unprepared to teach about race. And it is really daunting when you're just thinking about it by yourself. So being in a collective, thinking about it in a community, is really helpful in order for teachers to feel supported and have a network and have a supportive community. The same thing with parents, and I believe the same thing also with school leaders. So not thinking about it as just what do I do, but thinking about it like which group could you join in order to help those type of efforts, and to be reminded that this is a really difficult moment in our history, but the U.S. goes through these histories where these moments where there's some progress and then a massive push against that progress.
And in those situations, a lot of times unexpected opportunities arise because now there's a conversation happening, and it might feel like a slog, and it might feel hard, and it might feel like you're up against a lot of forces that are trying to push you down. But in actuality, having the conversation and getting the word out and making sure that people understand that the issues that children and educators are facing nowadays, I mean, this is really important. Do you see like what kind of words of hope or the future, what do you want to say to educators and students and parents today, just looking forward? Is there anything that you want to say that might inspire them?
Oh, thank you. I was very inspired by the teachers. The teachers were very brave. The teachers were really thoughtful. Like I mentioned before, I wish that I would have sat in classrooms, and just thinking about my own education and then what I saw, for example, in these classrooms, I'm really hopeful that teachers, for example, reading the book, can see themselves in the book and then see how they could also improve, connect with others, learn with their students. So I'm very helpful about that. I'm very hopeful that when I think about the students also and their curiosity and the questions that they brought to the classroom, and really the students would think about things and point out contradictions. And I think that instead of just saying like, oh, well, for example, was just a social construct, etc. We really should lean into the contradictions that students point out. And I think that that would be helpful for us in order to have honest conversations too.
What are some of those contradictions that you're hearing from the students? What are they pointing out?
Yeah, so for example, like I had mentioned before, in terms of whether the Latinx group is a racial group or not, and then how to think about race and racism. One contradiction that the students didn't point out, but that I noticed was, for example, the students, because they had been in this bilingual education program since elementary school, they had been in a bilingual education program since elementary school that would teach them about different social justice aspects in the Latinx community, affecting the Latinx community. And when I witnessed the lessons, I was very excited that the teachers were, for example, teaching about the different movements, et cetera, and some of the histories that usually are left out. But it was interesting because when I sat in the classroom, the students seemed sometimes bored with the lessons, which struck me because the literature demonstrates that students want to learn about race and different social justice lessons, etc. So I was very surprised by that. I was puzzled, and when I asked the students in interviews, "Oh, do you want to learn about social justice? Do you want to learn about race or racism?" They all said yes. They really wanted to. They found it very interesting. But then when I asked, when I tried to get at this disconnect, they seem bored in classrooms, disengaged, but they really want to learn about it. What's going on? What I found was that they felt that they were having the same types of lessons about race over and over again. Mm. And to give an example, one teacher in the high school level was teaching about the farm workers movement in California, led by Dolores Huertas, Esta Chavez, and other folks. And the students interrupted the teacher and said, "Yes, miss, we know about la huelga, huelga, huelga," in a very monotone voice. So we really need to make sure to have students progress through their education in terms of what are the ideas being taught about race. Because if we're only teaching, for example, in the elementary level, which is a good thing for the elementary level to teach, obviously, about, for example, being inclusive, not judging others based on how they look or treating them badly because of how they look, etc. These are excellent lessons, obviously, and very needed lessons in elementary school. The issue is when these lessons don't progress and high school students are learning the same type of lessons, right? So we need to progress in terms of what are we teaching about race in order for students to progress their ideas about what is race and racism in our society and how it functions and affects our lives.
Are there ways that you suggest that students themselves can advocate for just that, for what they want? I mean, you mentioned yourself, you wish that you had this understanding back when you were a student. So, doing this research, writing the book, being in the classrooms, talking to students, talking to teachers, what do you recommend the students actually do to make change within their own schools and their own curriculum?
Oh, thank you. This is a great question, because if we see historically, students have a lot of power. They do need to organize, though. It's not helpful if just one person decides to do one thing. Students do have to organize in order for them to provide their voice to, for example, go to speak to the school board, lobby for different types of instruction that they have access to, for example, curriculum, etc. So it is something that students definitely should do, again, as a collective.
I'm curious, Laura, in writing this book, and doing this research, and props to you for doing it, because it feels like a really big undertaking, but so important and something that touches you personally. Was there anything that you discovered about yourself, maybe in your past, your history, or uncovered as you, as a person, as somebody who is part of society and looking out there, as you were writing your book? What did you learn about you as a writer?
Oh, so many things. I don't really know what to choose. Like I mentioned before, there was a lot of questioning about whether some of the ideas that I had about race were correct or not. And one of the things that I thought about was Latinx being a group. And looking back, it was something. even though I was against essentializing the group, even though I was against stereotypes, I think that a lot of the times I did have an idea of the Latinx group as something that I recognize now it's much different. My idea about what it is, because when I think about how race is made and that it is in terms of the unequal distribution of resources, that is what makes the racialized groups, then it makes it very clear to me why these different contradictions exist. Why is it that, for example, some people feel very burdened or pigeonholed into thinking like, oh, well, I'm not Latinx, for example. Something that I kind of understood or sympathized with, like, yes, no one wants to be stereotyped, etc. But now seeing it as a racialized idea, I see why there's even more like pushback against it. So there's lots of different things that have changed in my thinking, but I think that that's one that I could share here.
Yeah. If you could take your book and hand it to one person in the world, and I'll throw in the caveat that you're guaranteed they're going to read your book through and through.
Thank you.
and you can't say Oprah. Don't say Oprah. Everybody wants to give their book to Oprah. We'll keep Oprah out of this one. But who would you give your book to?
Wow, I've never thought about that, because one of the things that I'm hoping is for teachers to read it. So it's interesting because I'd have to answer someone who, that would be able to share the book with as many teachers as possible.
That's a great answer. And I think teachers, parents, educators in general, everybody should check out your book. Where can people go to find it, find out more about you? Can you give us your website and your details?
Thank you. Yes, my website is my first name and my last name together, laurachavez-moreno.com. And the book is found in Bookshop, in Amazon, at the Harvard Education Press, which is the publisher, and also at Barnes & Noble.
I want to call you Professor Laura because I see the name there. Before we started, you're like, you can call me Laura. Laura, yeah. Professor Laura. Thank you so much for being with us today. This was really enlightening and such an important topic nowadays. I appreciate you.
Oh, thank you so much. I also appreciate you, and I'm happy to hear any questions or follow-up comments that your listeners may have for me. Please reach out.
Absolutely. Yes. Reach out to Laura. And likewise, if you have comments or questions, you can always leave them in the YouTube chat. So the show airs on the radio station as well. It's audio version and on YouTube. So you can always leave your questions and comments below. Make sure also, especially in regards to YouTube, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, get notifications. All of that really helps our channel to grow. And that way we can bring you more wonderful authors like Laura and more. So until next time, all of my bookish buddies, please keep on reading those books. Visit us on our website at thisbooks.makeyou.com. You can also sign up for our Webby award-winning newsletter there. We're on Facebook and Instagram as well, and sometimes on TikTok. I think we're still on TikTok as well, again, as on YouTube. Until next time, all of my bookish buddies, please enjoy all of the books that make you exactly who you are.
Books make you hope. Books make you dream. Books make you laugh. Books make you scream. This is the Books That Make You show, discussing books with authors and experts, unraveling the inner pages of all the books that help make us who we are.